and welcome to today's webinar, part 3 of the Cloud Economics and FinOps series, FinOps Optimized phase, brought to you by your Insight Managed Services team in partnership with Microsoft. I'm Claire Folger, your CSP Marketing Coordinator at Insight, and I will be your moderator today. Before we begin, I wanted to cover a few housekeeping items. This webcast is designed to be interactive between you and the presenters. The webcast console you are looking at can be completely customized. You can resize or move any of the windows that you have open. If you have any questions during the webcast, you can click on the Q&A widget at the bottom and submit your question. All questions from this webcast will be captured, and there will be a Q&A during the last few minutes of the presentation. If you are experiencing any technical difficulties, please visit the webcast help guide by clicking on the question mark icon below the presentation window. The help guide covers common technical issues. I also wanted to remind you that you have the chance to win a copy of the O'Reilly book, Cloud FinOps, today based on your participation. Attend all 4 sessions and get a chance to win free access to take the FinOps Certified Practitioner exam, a $300 value. This webinar series, along with the book, will give you a solid foundation to work toward passing the FinOps Practitioner certification. After today's session, our lucky winners will receive an email from me with the details on receiving their free copy of the book. I would now like to turn this presentation over to our presenters, Marcus and Jeff. The floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much, Claire. All right, well, thank you all for joining us today. My name is Marcus Benson. I'm part of the National Cloud Architecture team here at Insight as part of our Cloud and DevOps division. I'm our National Principal Architect for FinOps and a former Microsoft Azure Global Black Belt for Azure Cost Management. And with me today, I've got Jeff Amos. And Jeff, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure presenting with you again today through this series. My name is Jeff Amos. My title is a Cloud Financial Architect. It's relatively unique inside of Microsoft. A net new role that's really focused on helping customers get the most out of their IT investment over time. I always classify myself as a data center architect that likes to do his own taxes. So it really rolls into modernizing workloads and accelerating the value of investment. And again, it's a pleasure to present again with you, Marcus.
Likewise, Jeff. All right, well, today's session is going to be focused around the FinOps Optimize phase. So if you recall, our last 2 sessions covered, really the FinOps methodology, as a whole. And then we went deep into the FinOps Inform phase. And, the second phase of the 3-phased approach of FinOps is the Optimize phase. So the optimize phase is really all around right sizing, automation, bring your own license programs, reservation and pre-commit programs, and even modernizing workloads to reduce IT overhead and gain ROI and efficiency. So we're really going to be talking about these main areas today, which are usage optimization, which those right sizing, deleting idle resources, those kinds of optimization activities. Rate optimization, which is the reservation, pre-commit programs, and other pricing discounting programs. We'll talk a little bit about Azure Hybrid Use benefits, and then we'll talk a little bit about some of the native and open source tools that are available to help you identify these opportunities and take action on these opportunities to save money.
And keep in mind that offer constructs from cloud providers, not just Azure, but also GCP and AWS, are always evolving. So a lot of the constructs, those cloud economic savings levers that we're going to be covering today that roll into that optimization phase will evolve over time, which is great if you're in that FinOps type of role for a customer. It's kind of like job security, since it's always kind of an evolving target, if you will, with different savings levers that you could pull. But certainly this represents where we're at today, knowing that these offer constructs will evolve as we move forward.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, these programs are always changing, so you do need to make sure to follow, the Microsoft Cost Management blog and other resources for those updates. All right, so the first area that we're going to talk about is the activities and best practices of the optimize phase. So the optimize phase is really all around enabling fast feedback loops, real-time decision-making, predicting and planning purchasing capacity, removing unused, underutilized resources, right-sizing, centralizing buying power for RI programs, workload management, automation capabilities, and as well as just making sure that you're selecting the right pricing program, for your organization. So we're going to talk a little bit about all of these different areas today. And as always, if you have any questions, please do feel free to drop those questions in the Q&A and chat. All right, so the optimize phase, let's talk a little bit about some best practices. But the first, kind of area to cover, and probably one of the most important pieces to understand, is just the basic, simple equation of optimization in the cloud. In order to reduce your cost in the cloud, you can either reduce your usage quantity, or you can reduce the rate that you're paying for that resource or that SKU. So those are kind of the buckets that we're going to be talking about optimization in, which is usage optimization and rate optimization. And as a best practice, usage optimization, which is again right-sizing, deleting idle resources, enabling configuration changes within your resources to enable things like auto scale. Those decisions really should always be decentralized to the actual workload owners. So the person that's actually making those changes, clicking the button to make those changes, really should be that workload owner, because they're the ones that understand the ins and outs of that workload and any potential requirements that need to be considered. Rate optimization decisions as a best practice really should be centralized to the FinOps and procurement teams. And the reason being is that allows you to maximize your buying power as an organization and to manage those RIs and pre-purchases from a central level to maximize those savings. And another best practice to consider when it comes to optimizing is the order of optimization. You always want to right size and go through the process of usage optimization before you pre-commit and purchase and reserve capacity for those resources.
Yeah, those are great points. And one thing I wanted to add was we're used to that P times Q model, that price times quantity, that usage quantity times rate. But there's also that dimension of time. Because we may start with just a lift and shift. Let's take your VMs from on-premise hypervisors and move them into the infrastructure as a service layers in the cloud target, and you see a reduction in cash flow. But you may not keep them there, or you may keep them in pay-go type of offer constructs or price or rate constructs initially, and then adopt 1 or 3 year RIs at a lower price point over time as you discover these long-running instances of compute units. So you also have to keep in mind that time frame, and you go through iterations of modernization over time, as well as taking in different offer constructs, depending on what is most beneficial at that particular time. Also, I love the fact that we mentioned procurement here. Now, coming from the Microsoft side, we go back to our customers and renegotiate deals on usually a yearly basis. So looping in those procurement teams and giving them the visibility into the things you're actually using today, as well as the things you project you're going to be using in the next fiscal years, helps you influence those negotiations to get that best rate. So looping in the procurement teams is always super helpful. It certainly makes negotiation processes much easier, and diving into like the granular detail usage data as well as the price points attached to them give you insights on getting very targeted discounts on the things you're going to be leveraging in certain timeframes. So excellent points.
Great. And yeah, another thing to point out here too when it comes to the optimize phase is the FinOps team, the core FinOps teams, core responsibility and main responsibility here from the optimize phase is to make sure that they are providing timely and meaningful reports to the engineering teams and to those workload owners so that they can make the right decisions and be good stewards of their resources in a timely fashion, enabling, again, those fast feedback loops and being able to respond quickly to issues. So now we'll dive into, again, those two types of optimization, which, once again, is usage and rate optimization opportunity. So first, we'll talk a little bit about some of the usage optimization opportunities that you should be looking for in your environment. So usage optimization is typically broken out into a few different categories: idle, orphaned resources, right-sizing resources, and automating and configuring things like auto-scale and some of those cloud-native features. So when it comes to right-sizing, some of the biggest areas of optimization that we see in most of our clients' environments are around VM right-sizing. So downsizing or upgrading a VM to a new generation can oftentimes provide savings. Even if you aren't downsizing, if there is a new VM generation, in most cases, those are using a newer chipset and can provide the same level of performance for a price discount. So just be aware that when new VM families come out, that is definitely something that should be considered and looked at when it comes to your VM usage. SQL database right-sizing is probably one of the biggest areas of optimization we see when working with clients. And in a lot of cases, it's just selecting the wrong SKU type. Maybe they're using a vCore SKU when they should be utilizing a DTU or a standard, or even maybe a serverless SKU, depending on the workload type. If it's a very spiky, workload that, maybe there's only one job or 2 jobs throughout a month, maybe serverless with auto pods might be the best fit for that workload.
I personally love Azure Functions for a lot of the business logic, because it's completely serverless and it represents a lot of the business logic components in an application. And it's transaction-based billing on the cloud side. So you're really paying for those transactions that you're actually leveraging, so, as a good example.
Yeah, and any time that you can right-size or move an instance or a resource away from an IaaS workload into a platform as a service type workload like managed instance or Azure Functions, as Jeff was just saying, that's where you're really going to find the biggest ROI and biggest, bang for your buck when it comes to optimization, because not only are you going to see the cost reduction, but you're also going to save IT resources, reduce time to market, and just, reduce the overall support required to manage those resources. So again, PaaS right-sizing, great opportunity to reduce overhead, to reduce some of the burden on your IT resources. Storage optimization is another area of right-sizing I see a lot of organizations struggling with. Not putting data into the right storage tiers, maybe not enabling data lifecycle policy where you can automate some of that movement of data from different, hot to cool or cool to archive tiers, and then not, leveraging standard SSD where it's appropriate, and just putting everything into premium SSD workloads, which we see a lot of customers doing.
Yeah, and an additional example. Additional example there are orphan disks. I've seen a lot of customers actually deploy VMs. They attach like an SSD or a standard disk to that VM instance, and then they deprovision the VM instance, but not necessarily the disk. So there's always that kind of cleanup process. And a lot of the tool sets help you kind of identify those in an easier way. And it's really kind of a low-hanging fruit. It's an easy change that influences the required cash flow, and certainly something to stay on top of. Because historically, and I think I mentioned in previous sessions, operations teams are great at deploying resources, but historically we're always a wee bit challenged on deprovisioning resources, following up and making sure that things that are idle or orphaned are actually deprovisioned. And that's always a critical process in the overall FinOps activities.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you for that, Jeff. Yeah, idle orphaned resources, disks are one of the main culprits of that, but we see this, across a lot of different resource types like network interfaces, public IP addresses, resource groups and network security groups, SQL databases that are just left out there idle, unused. And these obviously have a cost and, are obviously what we would consider a low-hanging fruit optimization opportunity. Automation is another area that you should be considering when it comes to right-sizing, especially in dev environments, making sure that you are scheduling resources off at night and on the weekends when they're not needed, when they're not in use, when there's not dev teams actually working on those and testing those workloads. And then appending Azure Hybrid Benefit on your eligible resources, another automation capability that you can do to reduce spend. And typically, AHB can offer a savings of around 42% on average. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in some of our follow-on slides. So this brings us to our first poll question. The first poll question is, do you have visibility today into your cloud resource performance and how much or if your resources are actually being used? We'll give folks a minute here to get some answers in.
There was a quick comment in the Q&A that there's newer options to help avoid orphan disks in Azure, options to delete disks and prompts that you get when you're actually deprovisioning or deleting a VM. That's correct. We do add to like the inherent automation processes and provisioning items that have dependencies on other metered items, especially when you look at like the resource group or even subscription basis. So excellent point. One thing to keep in mind there is when you automate provisioning as well as even automate deprovisioning versus in through the portal, you want to make sure that that entire process, since it's more at a granular kind of API level, is inclusive of deprovisioning the dependent items, the items that are attached to a VM or to other meters and have that dependency. You lose some of that visibility potentially. You don't get that pop-up window, for example, in the portal saying, hey, you have a managed disk attached. Do you want to deprovision that as well? So certainly keep in mind as you focus on a lot of the automation aspects, the scripting of provisioning and deprovisioning, that you also look at those dependent items.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's also, reporting tools that we'll mention here a little bit later in the call that will help you to identify some of those idle orphan resources. All right, so we've got some results in. It looks like most of the folks on this call have limited visibility today into cloud resource performance and idle resources. I think that's about what I was expecting. So,
yeah, it's kind of it's almost like a trick. It's almost like a trick question. It's like there's things that you may know you don't know yet inside of like visibility or transparency of reporting. It's almost like being called an expert. I never really feel like an expert because the more I know, the more things I realize I don't know yet. And that's very inherent in like visibility or transparency of like cost management of cloud services is as you get more insight, you discover, hey, we need another depth of insight. It's that peeling the onion type of exercise. So it's an interesting question and great feedback on that one.
Yeah, and again, we'll highlight the importance of this. One of the most important skill sets on your FinOps team is going to be having a deep understanding of what kind of information can come out of the raw data set. And that includes things like optimization data and opportunities to right-size that. In a lot of cases, this information does come through, cost data as well, and you can identify a lot of these opportunities there. The next area that we'll talk about is rate optimization, and this is really probably the area that you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck as far as savings go. And this is the area of reservations, reserved instances, and reserved capacity programs. Reserved instance program is available for virtual machines. It is a pre-commitment program where you commit to either 1 or a 3-year term for those virtual machines. You can choose from an all upfront, partial, or monthly billing option. And you can also choose to share the benefit of this RI across the organization or scope it to a specific subscription or resource group if you have cost allocation or show back chargeback potential requirements for RI. And there's also the option to choose instance size flexibility, which we would definitely encourage you to take advantage of because it does help to make sure that those RIs and those pre-purchases actually get used. If there's any changes to your workloads, then those RIs don't sit there unused, unattached to a resource. They're going to convert, within that instance family to be able to cover additional resources.
Yeah, those are good points, because we don't want to get customers stuck in a situation that they've historically been in, where they buy X amount of physical gear or bare metal in the cloud. We wanted to provide that flexibility. So if the resource requirements, number of vCPUs, memory footprint, or even the transfer rates to back-end storage change over time, you have that flexibility. So for example, if right up front you pick like a D5 compute instance on Azure and commit to a 3-year term, you're not stuck with just that D5. You could always migrate to a D5 V2 or V3. I think we're up to like V4s and V5s at this point, or even within the same series, depending on your technical requirements as they scale up or scale down. It does provide you that flexibility while maintaining that consistent cash flow. And I mention that because that allows you to do budgetary planning and allocation over time in a much easier way.
Absolutely. And the other rate optimization opportunity is around reserve capacity programs in Azure. And reserve capacity is available for over 20 different Azure services today. Just be aware that the terms and conditions change depending on the service that you are looking at. For example, Databricks has a no cancellation, no exchange policy, and does have a little bit of a manual analysis, process to it. So you need to be very, very aware of the ins and outs of these programs before you actually commit and make those purchases. For example, with Databricks, you're actually purchasing DBCU capacity, which is database compute units or capacity units, versus DBUs, which are what you're actually consuming with Databricks, which are not the same. A database unit within Databricks, follows a ratio for DBCUs. So if you're using 1 DBU for premium SQL, it's only worth 0.22 DBCUs for your actual capacity. So when you're committing, you're actually committing to DBCUs and not DBUs. So there is a mathematical process you need to go through to actually understand what your DBCU consumption is before you pull the trigger. And I've seen customers get confused by this and actually reserve DBUs instead of DBCUs, which ended up in a bad situation. So don't do that. Make sure that you are reading about these programs, understanding the ins and outs of these programs before you go and actually purchase these. And just understand that, again, those terms change for every service. There are huge savings available with reserve capacity and reserve instance programs. This is a very old report that unfortunately is no longer around, and I miss it, but it's the Reserve Instance Purchase Impact Report. And this was part of the Cloud In tool that Microsoft purchased years back. And it would allow you to input the region, the instance type, your average predicted runtime, your quantity of machines, and the term, and it would give you a break-even point and show you exactly how much you would save, with those dependencies and those, those assumptions. So if your workload is running 24/7, typically your break-even point for an RI is going to be around month 7 to month 8. So just be aware that, if you have a workload that looks like a great opportunity for RI, you're asking the right questions. Is this workload going to be around 12 months from now? If so, is it on 100% of the time? Is it on 75% of the time? And you need to understand those pieces before you commit, obviously, because, you want to be maximizing those savings, and unused RIs are really the equivalent of throwing money out the window.
Yeah, and an additional aspect to keep in mind is you may not apply like reserved instance pricing to your entire compute footprint. I always recommend to customers of identifying that consistent base. Like if you have 5,000 compute units or VMs out there, and really only 20%, maybe 30% are running consistently, and I just kind of throw that number out there as an example, apply RIs to those. Other compute units that have potentially variable uptimes or utilization, you may leverage spot level pricing, especially for dev test workloads, or you might leverage PayGo if you've already implemented that automation process of bringing those compute units down during off hours. So certainly a great activity is, well, let's identify our compute base, that consistent 24/7, 365 days a year running compute base that's required, and apply those RI constructs to that as a first step, incrementally lowering your overall required cash flow, and then look at those automated practices for those variable uptime compute units that are above that compute base. Keeping in mind, as we mentioned, you can switch out those RI instances so that base can be switchable between different compute types and resource allocations. But certainly identifying this is my whatever percentage of consistent compute that I'm always using, and apply these constructs to those first.
Absolutely. All right, so next poll question is, do you have visibility into how your pre-commitments and reservations are being used today? So we'll just give it a minute here for folks to get their answers in. And while they're getting their answers in, I will say too, just to add on to Jeff's points before, those non-production workloads, just because they may not be great candidates for RIs, doesn't mean they can't be covered or at least get the benefit from RIs either. Because of the instance size flexibility, if you know that those dev workloads are using mostly D-series machines and you're typically running about 100 machines, but they're only on 20% of the time, maybe you buy 20 D1 instances, set them to instance size flexibility, and monitor that coverage from there. And this also brings us to the point too of centralized RI management. When it's being managed from that top level, organizationally, looking at some of those FinOps KPIs that we mentioned before, like RI coverage versus on-demand rates. When you're managing it at that level, that really does allow you to maximize, again, that discounting percentage and the savings that you're going to get across the entire organization by allowing you to purchase those at that organizational level and share those benefits across, even some of those dev environments like I mentioned. Wow, this is a very close, close poll all the way across.
The percentage.
Yeah, so it looks like a broad mix here within the group. So majority has limited visibility into RI usage today. Obviously, there are reporting tools in each cloud provider to help you monitor the usage of those RIs. Within Microsoft Azure, you have the portal view within where you can go to the reservations blade and you can see utilization percentage across all of your RI purchases. If you've got a billing reader role, you can now see that within the Azure Cost Management portal as well, where you couldn't before unless you were an RI owner or you were given RI reader roles on those reservations. Microsoft has changed that, so as long as you are a billing reader, you can now see that RI utilization across your entire estate.
Yeah, and as Marcus mentioned, it does help to have that centralized team that is even creating internal reports back to the users, the business units that are consuming the resources, to help them identify those. Because a lot of times, especially as a business unit, we're focused on let's just get the workload out there, let's monetize it as quickly as possible. And we lose insight into visibility of that activity of are we doing the right thing? So sometimes those internal groups, the formalized FinOps type of teams, help identify those opportunities. Hence the business units having more awareness of what's transpiring with their RI adoption.
Another big area of savings potentially in Microsoft Azure is licensing optimization. So Microsoft has a program called Azure Hybrid Use Benefit, which allows you to bring your own licenses for Windows and SQL Server, as long as you have software assurance for those licenses. So from a Windows Server standpoint, it's applicable to both standard and data center versions, as long as, again, you have software assurance. You have dual use rights available for up to 180 days on the standard edition and unlimited for data center. So if you're migrating, you do have 180 days with standard licenses. to use those in both on-premise and in the cloud while you migrate those workloads. And from a SQL standpoint, it's available for SQL database, vCore only, and SQL managed instance, which is the PaaS version of SQL. You can use it against SQL Server Standard or Enterprise editions with, again, software assurance active. And you have dual use rights available in SQL as well for up to 180 days on either version. And there's a preview feature within the Azure Cost Management Platform called Centrally Managed SQL Server AHB. And we'll talk a little bit about that in the next slide. But resources using AHB can run in Azure only during the software assurance term. So this is really important. If your software assurance term runs out, you either have to re-up that software assurance term, move that workload, outside of Azure, or deprovision that workload. So just be aware of that. And Microsoft does reserve the right to audit the usage of licenses at any time.
Yeah, and the hybrid benefit really helps you leverage your pre-existing investment into licensing for the OS and for SQL instances, as Marcus mentioned. And an interesting note, especially with that license portability, is you're able to leverage the license not just in the cloud, but on-premise. Now, that's interesting from the finance perspective, because historically, we've always classified licensing spend for OS as a capital expenditure. Well, under evolving accounting guidelines, you're able to have a little bit more flexibility when you could actually bring the workload back on premise. So I have a lot of customers ask me, well, can we leverage that? Now, while Microsoft isn't an accredited accounting organization, so we can't provide accounting advice, I've witnessed some customers actually employ that so they could reclassify spend over time. That really helps them manage their budgets, their capital expenditures and operational expenditures. And this really plays into that. It's one of those leverage points.
Yeah, and managing compliance of Azure Hybrid Benefit, for Windows, unfortunately today is still a little bit manual. But Microsoft has released a new capability on the SQL side called Centrally Managed AHB for SQL. And this is a really great way to make sure that you are maintaining compliance and not worrying about, getting audited and overusing licenses. So again, it is a preview feature, so you do have to go to the preview portal. But once you're there, you can then choose your scope that you want to apply your license counts to, either to the entire organization or to individual subscriptions or groups. And then you assign the licenses. So you choose your number of core licenses for Server Standard and Enterprise. It will give you a normalized core license count. And then you can apply that across the organization, and Azure will auto-manage the application of those licenses to keep you in compliance and make sure that you're not overusing SQL AHB in the cloud. And again, AHB will typically save you, on average, around 42% versus not leveraging Azure Hybrid Benefit. Again, it is against the number of core licenses that you own with active software assurance. And you can utilize the Azure Hybrid Benefit Savings Calculator to look at your license counts and how many devices that will cover for you and the potential savings that you'll realize. All right, so next poll question. Do you have visibility into any strategy to manage Azure Hybrid use benefits utilization today?
Yeah, almost another little trick question, because they may not, business units may not have visibility into actual usage. They may provision a VM and go ahead and pick the AHB type of benefit, which you have the perfect capability to do. But certainly on the accounting as well as even the procurement side, they're always super interested of, are we licensed at the correct rate? So sometimes those reports don't bubble back into the business units. So it's kind of tricky in that respect.
Yeah, and we'll talk about some reporting tools as well.
Exactly.
In the next session. Well, so far we've got 100% visibility and a management strategy into cool. AHB. Okay, great. Sounds like some folks on this call are leveraging the program. Awesome. All right, well, we've talked a lot about different activities for optimization. Now, what are some of the KPIs that you can set to measure your success and see if you're actually gaining value. One that we've mentioned a couple of times and in a couple of different calls is the RI versus on-demand usage metric. So monitoring your percentage of RI coverage against your entire virtual machine utilization is a great way to measure your success as you mature. More immature organizations may be setting a KPI of 40, 50% RI coverage versus their on-demand rate. And as you mature, maybe you're shooting for more like 80 or 90% coverage of RIs against your virtual machine spend. A great way to measure your success from an optimization standpoint is to measure your average cost per normalized compute hour over time. The reason why this is so important is if you are optimizing usage optimization and reservations, you should be seeing that average cost per compute hour either staying steady or decreasing over time. If you're seeing that going up, then there's probably opportunities for you to optimize and manage that to get that to a better baseline or to get that to start going down. Right-sizing opportunity value, another KPI to obviously pay attention to. Usage on weekdays versus weekends, maybe in VM environments or dev environments. Percentage of dev resources running nights and weekends. Percentage of oversized machines versus the entire estate. Percentage of orphaned resources versus the entire estate, idle resources over 30 days. These are all different metrics and KPIs that you can keep an eye on that will allow you to measure your success and your efficiency and effectiveness over time for optimization.
Yeah, and I personally love, as you mentioned, the average cost per normalized CPU, not just in the cloud, but even comparing that back to historically where we've been. Now, what is the average cost per normalized CPU even on premise and as we take on the cloud target? Because in a lot of customer examples, that pay-go scenario, paying by the hour for VMs, is almost equivalent to running a compute unit on premise because it's at that kind of premium type of pricing. And I've seen it in industry verticals as high as like $6,250 per average normalized CPU for an on-premise unit, kind of on par with pay-go, and then seeing about 30% reduction for one-year RIs and almost worst case, like 60 to 70% cash flow reduction per average normalized CPU for those RI constructs on the cloud side. It's a great success measure and also a reality check, even at smaller increments of time, even a month-by-month level. Are we doing better with these investments over time? Some of these KPIs are also evolving very rapidly. Even as we modernize our workloads to the PaaS layers, we're now having potentially different metric. How many transactions per second per dollar over time are we seeing? And is that reducing? As we're modernizing business logic to Azure functions, those features that don't require an underlying compute unit, those not serverless type of roles, is that having an impact? Are we able to do more with the same budgetary allocation, or are we reducing over time? So it's a great metric, and one of the ones I use to even measure success after moving workloads from on-premise data centers.
Great, thank you for that. Yeah, so how do you actually monitor those metrics? We'll talk a little bit about some of the tools that are available, native and open source tools that can help you to optimize your Azure spend. The first native tool is Azure Advisor. Azure Advisor is really your personal advisor for your well-architected framework in Microsoft Azure. It auto-runs in the background and analyzes your resources against the 5 pillars of the well-architected framework, one of which is cost optimization. You can customize your usage thresholds for your recommendations from a cost optimization standpoint. So for VMs, you can customize the CPU, the average max CPU that will, filter out recommendations that don't matter to you. You can drill into these recommendations to see additional detail, to see potential savings. You can configure alerts against these recommendations, and you can also dismiss or postpone these recommendations if they don't make sense or if they're not valid for your organization. There's also a new preview feature within Advisor called the Advisor Score. And what that does is it really gamifies this advisor tool and allows you to view a score by each of these well-architected framework categories, and allow you to really track your progress over time to see if you're being effective in managing your resources. And this can be looked at on a monthly, daily, weekly basis at multiple different levels organizationally against specific subscriptions to really monitor, again, your performance and effectiveness with managing those resources over time.
Also,
and you can also
sorry to jump in. With Azure Advisor, as well as some of the recommendations coming from it, we just looked at the web portal, the web representation of the data set, but also keep in mind that all of the things that you see within the Azure portal are accessible via programmatic APIs. So you can roll a lot of these data sets into your pre-existing processes, into your internal tools, into your budgetary allocation type of projection tools. So you can refine it a wee bit more, since I find a lot of customers don't have their finance team actually logging into Azure portals, but actually pulling the API data sets, looking for those recommendations that they can push back into the business units. So keep in mind, as we're seeing the portal representations, those web representations of the data, certainly you have access to the raw data sets that you could loop into your existing processes.
Absolutely. Yeah, and there are other tools that leverage those APIs, like this Azure Cost Management Power BI template app, which also has a couple of optimization reports as well. It's not pulling in the advisor recommendations, but it is providing recommendations against Azure hybrid benefit usage, as well as reporting against your usage, so you can track and monitor that utilization over time, again, to make sure that you are staying in compliance against those license counts that you own. And then there's also a VM RI coverage report that will show you your usage by on-demand and RI and give you that percentage so you can monitor, again, that RI versus on-demand usage over time, as well as it provides recommendations for purchasing additional RIs, and will even normalize your recommended quantity against instance size flexibility. So if it's recommending, maybe one, standard DS2, it might, or 3 standard DS2s, maybe you should be purchasing 6 DS1s in the instance size flexibility instead to allow better convertibility of that device. There are also, beyond just the native tool sets that are available in the portal and through Power BI tools like this, there's also open source tools out there as well. For instance, there's this tool called the Azure Optimization Engine. This is an open source tool. You can find it on GitHub. And it's basically, if you think of it like a fully customizable Azure Advisor, that's got a Power BI front end. And it's also got a ton of additional recommendations that Azure Advisor does not recommend today, on top of the standard recommendations that you would see there. So this is a great tool for the more advanced organizations that are looking for additional areas to optimize, maybe some more customizable optimization thresholds, and that kind of thing. This is a really great tool to use.
Yeah, and a lot of times they're a great start to learn what those core data sets and APIs and connections are, where you could start with something like this and then mature it over time, roll it into your existing workflow, for example. Because to be fair, when you start digesting a lot of the transactions, the billing and usage data, and even the recommendations, it's kind of like drinking from the fire hose. It's a lot of information in a short amount of time. So a lot of these tools are an amazingly good start. What can we do? What is useful? What type of reports? And as Mark mentioned, what timeframes and audiences are these applicable to, so you could customize them even further?
Absolutely. Another open source tool that's available, again, on a GitHub, and I will provide the links to these in the presentation, is the Azure Continuous Cloud Optimization Insights dashboard. So this is a set of Power BI dashboards. There's a governance dashboard, an infrastructure dashboard, as well as some other dashboards. But the infrastructure dashboard has a couple of very useful optimization views. Again, Azure Advisor recommendations. So this is utilizing the APIs and the data sets to pull in all of your advisor recommendations into a Power BI dashboard that you can use to filter, to visualize the potential savings across your environment. And there's also an Azure idle resources view. So again, if you're looking for those idle orphaned resources across your environment, this is a great way to provide some reporting on that and a dashboard against that to monitor over time. And because it's in Power BI, you can publish these dashboards into a Power BI workspace. Give access into these dashboards outside of the portal for folks that maybe don't need access to the portal or maybe don't use the portal, for some of those automation focused engineers maybe. But again, it does require some data source access, so you do have to have some permissions to set this up. But once you have it set up, again, it's all access control based within Power BI service.
Yeah. And a quick challenge that I've seen from the customer base and even some of the open source tools is they're really designed for the masses, meaning they'll look at the subscription level. Sometimes they'll look at the resource group level. But one of the key kind of guidelines that we provide from FinOps.org is even tagging, those dynamic tagging down to like the cost center, profit center, so you could categorize workloads further. So I see even in the open source community providing these tools, not going to that level in a lot of cases yet, but that's something to keep in mind. Don't lose focus on tagging resources that cater to your overall processes and tracking and workflow. And a lot of these tools allow that customization. Let's pull in that data feed so we're exposed to those tags and we could customize and categorize the cost even further.
Thank you for that, Jeff. And another open source tool that we have available for orphaned resources is the Azure Orphan Resources Workbook. Again, this is a GitHub link that will be shared out with the presentation, but it's a very easy to deploy workbook that can be set up in the Azure portal and pinned to a dashboard. You just create a new workbook, and there's a set of JSON code that you just populate within that workbook, and you get all of these recommendations and an overview of orphaned resources, and that includes disks, network interfaces, public IPs, resource groups and network security groups, as well as route tables, load balancer, etc. So it does include a lot of different resource types, and could definitely help identify some potential savings. All right. Well, I think that brings us towards the end of our presentation here. So, as always, please go out and get FinOps certified if you haven't already. Please reach out to us, your partner, Insight, if you do need any mentorship along your FinOps journey. And please do register and attend the last session of our webinar series in 2 weeks, where we'll be covering the operate phase and talking about how you operationalize a FinOps practice and gain the right level of adoption.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that one. That's one of my favorites. How do we take all the concepts that we've conveyed in the previous webinar series and what are the actionable things we can go do, we can go build, we can integrate? So that I'm really looking forward to that presentation together.
Awesome. Likewise. All right. Well, if there's any questions from any of the attendees, please do input your questions in the Q&A in the chat. Don't see any new ones as of now. But again, I will be providing the links to all of the resources that we covered today, these native and open source tools. And please do, again, register for the rest of the series. You can utilize this QR code right here to do that. And there's also a QR code that you can scan to learn more about FinOps and request a follow-up from our team.
And as always, Marcus, it's a pleasure presenting with you. You just make this amazingly easy and are amazingly knowledgeable in this space. So it's been a great time. Thanks to you for that involvement and driving a lot of the content.
Likewise, Jeff, thank you for all of your support throughout this, and looking forward to continuing to work with you and geek out with you on further FinOps topics.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Jeff and Marcus. That was a great presentation, and thank you to everyone who attended. We really appreciate it. And please don't forget to register for the fourth and final session of our series. And with that, I hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Thanks all.